Moments of technological transition are fiendishly hard for strategic planners. They must decide whether to invest in a highly optimized version of an old technology or chance their hand on a prototype version of the new. Hybrids sometimes turn up at these points of inflection. They are chimeras, a bit of both to service the needs of the uncertain and the indecisive. And that is the story of the Ryan Fireball. From the cockpit forward, it is a late war piston engine fighter. The back half, however, is that of an early post war jet. You might think that such an animal would be confined to the test bench, but it in fact entered production and saw some squadron service. As was often the case in the early to middle 1940s, the instigator of this curious beast was the US Navy. It hadn't escaped their notice that jet aircraft were flying in the UK in 1942. They also had acquired 2 examples of the P-59 Aerocobra. But the evidence they acquired from British data and the P-59 flight testing suggested to them that in their early form, jets were unsuitable for landing on a carrier. Their approach speeds were too high, landing rolls too long, and throttle response was too slow to allow them to take a wave off. Fuel consumption was also problematic for a US Navy that had learned to fight and win over the vast Pacific Ocean. But even so, the Navy felt that it needed a counter to these new jets. And hence we get the Fireball, a composite fighter that the Navy commissioned in February 1943, having launched a competition with 9 firms in late 1942. The majority of these 9 competitors were eliminated on the basis that they were already producing fighters for the Navy. Distraction was not what was needed at that critical point in the war. And so the unlikely winner of the Navy's competition was the Ryan Aeronautical Company of San Diego, California. The Who Company was probably most people's reaction. Ryan had never produced a carrier aircraft, nor, in point of fact, had they ever built a fighter. Their only work of note was producing about 1,000 PT-22 recruit trainers for the Army Air Force. They believed that their chief engineer, Ben T. Solomon, had made such a compelling case in his 3-hour pitch that he convinced the Navy. Now, I'm sure his pitch was one for the ages, but really the Navy didn't want any issues with piston-engined fighter production. A year later, McDonnell would have the same good fortune. They would take better advantage. So Ryan received an order for 3 XFR-1s and a static test article. All were due in mid-1944. You might be expecting me to now narrate how Ryan made a total mess of the resulting effort. But no, they actually did a great job. Faced with the worry of how to defend the fleet from jet aircraft able to attack from high altitudes and at speeds of 500 miles an hour or higher, the Navy wanted a fast fighter able to operate from an escort or fleet carrier. The former stipulation meant that a relatively low takeoff and landing speed would be essential, as escort carriers had short decks and weren't very fast. Lack of speed limited the amount of wind they could put across the deck. The pairing of piston and jet engines would give the new fighter good high and low altitude performance. When on piston power, it would have the fast-reacting throttle that the Navy believed was essential for carrier landings. When using the jet alongside the piston engine, it would have superior high-altitude performance than a piston engine of equivalent total power. A 1,350 horsepower Wright Cyclone 9 radial provided that piston power. The jet engine was a General Electric J31 giving 1,600 pounds of thrust. The J31 was the same engine used in the experimental Bell Aerocomet. It was a compact centrifugal flow type very similar to Frank Whittle's Powerjet's W2. As the Rolls-Royce Welland, it powered the Gloucester Meteor. One of the Fireball pilot's favourite display tricks would be to feather the prop and zoom around just using the jet engine, much to the initial fear and eventual delight of observers. The Cyclone 9 was, however, the primary power source and was found also on some versions of the F-4 Wildcat as well as a wide variety of typically larger aircraft. Although the engine arrangement was essentially fixed, how Ryan packaged these engines to achieve the required performance was up to them. Their design was for a low-wing monoplane. Although outwardly conventional, it was in fact quite innovative. For example, it was the first Navy aircraft to use a laminar flow wing. This kind of very efficient aerofoil had been used with great success on the P-51 Mustang. It allowed for much greater fuel efficiency and high-altitude performance than previous wing designs. But it was hard to make these wings, and a big part of the success of the P-51 was the extremely smooth surface and fine manufacturing tolerances that North American were able to achieve. Ryan created their own version of this technique, entailing an all-flush riveted exterior surface and all-metal control surfaces, another first for the Navy. Just to complete the hat-trick of firsts, the Fireball had a tricycle landing gear. The nature of arrested landings made this a bit suspect for the Navy. The most conventional aspect of the initial design was the tail. Because the basic design was comparable in size and weight to a Grumman Wildcat, Ryan decided to use the same tail as was fitted to that aircraft. This would prove a mistake, albeit a fixable one. Construction of the prototype Fireballs proceeded at a decent pace. The XFR-1 was just under 33 feet long with a 40-foot wingspan. It weighed a smidge over 8,500 pounds, so it was lighter than something like a Hellcat, but proportionally about the same size. The jet engine was mounted in the rear just behind the pilot. A long stainless steel jet pipe constructed in 3 sections ducted the exhaust out of the rear. The air intakes were in the wing roots, which was essentially the only place they could go given the rest of the packaging. The NACA helped Ryan test this with a 1/5 scale model at their wind tunnel in Virginia, and it seemed to work well enough throughout the speed range. An added benefit was that the cooling air flowed irrespective of whether the engine was running, helping it cool down after it had been shut off in flight. Unfortunately, the wind tunnel testing didn't take into account what would happen at different angles of attack. The prototype suffered from some stalling issues which were corrected with a redesign of the intakes. At the kind of moderate speeds the Fireball was capable of, the drag caused by the flat intakes didn't seem to have a meaningful negative effect. With the ducts at their root and the main gear in the first third of the wing panels, the wings were already complex structures. Ryan then made them fold and made the outer panels detachable, an impressive amount of ingenuity. Because the wings had relatively low drag for a piston engine fighter, the design of the flaps was always going to be important. The Fireball was initially fitted with a Douglas-designed double-slotted flap that could deflect 55 degrees in the landing position. The problem with this was that it led to a very high sink rate. Only one aircraft in the US tactical inventory had a higher one, and that was the Martin B-26 Marauder. The Navy considered this to be very unsatisfactory. Having tried blown flaps, Ryan settled on a 40-degree flap deflection being best. They also simplified the system, saving weight. One problem wind tunnel testing of the scale model did anticipate was the Wildcat tail. The basic logic in using this arrangement was a bit flawed. In its day, the Wildcat was a decent performer, but it was a 300-mile-an-hour fighter with a practical ceiling well below 40,000 feet. The Fireball was nearly 30% faster and could fly nearly 10,000 feet higher. More importantly, it had a circular fuselage cross-section for most of its length, whereas the Wildcat's fuselage started off circular and then tapered down to a knife edge at the rear. The centre of gravity of the Fireball was somewhat further back than on the Wildcat, which, alongside the aerodynamics, affected the tail's function. It transpired that directional stability was marginal with the Wildcat tail group. For example, in the wave-off position, the pilot couldn't turn hard to the right. Needless to say, this would be a problem given that the island on a carrier is on the right as the pilot approaches a straight deck. A pilot therefore needed to turn sharply to avoid it if he had to bolter. While Ryan and NACA worked on a new tail, the XFR-1 prototype flew with the Wildcat tail despite the dangers involved. Management felt that other test items like engine performance, aileron control forces, and general shakedown items could be accomplished without too much risk. The test pilot's life was a precarious one in this period. Although fixing the stability issues wasn't too hard, it took all sorts of efforts in testing to improve the Fireball's ability to turn to the right. They tried thinner, taller, and elliptical fins, but nothing worked. In the end, they went for a basic solution. The Fireball's rudder therefore deflects 35 degrees at full right, but only 25 degrees at full left. Given Ryan's inexperience and the novel nature of the new aircraft, it's surprising that so few major issues were encountered. After an extensive, short, but eventful testing program, production Fireballs were entering squadron service in March 1945. The first prototype with the original tail had started flying in June 1944. A second joined it in September. With a spare in hand, Ryan and the Navy decided to send the original unit to the Navy Test Center at Pax River. On the afternoon of October the 13th, Chief Test Pilot Robert Kurlinger took the aircraft up for a quick shakedown. He never returned. Although it couldn't be conclusively proved, the suspicion at the time was that Kurlinger had accidentally exceeded the compressibility limit of the airframe. The Fireball was a very clean plane and little was known about compressibility at the time. Kurlinger probably wasn't even aware of a problem until the aircraft abruptly broke up. Another Fireball was lost 5 months later on the 25th of March 1945. On this occasion, the test pilot, M.G. Maguire, started a dive at 35,000 feet but was unable to recover from it and smashed into the ground. Later dive testing revealed that rivets would start to slip and pop out if the pullout exceeded 7.5 G. The lightweight construction was remarkably strong, but excess flexing would create issues with metal fatigue that ultimately shortened the Fireball's life. Some of the accidents were hair-raising. On April the 5th, 1945, Dean Lake, one of the test pilots, was making a high-speed demonstration flight when the canopy suddenly blew off. As he pulled the nose up, the aircraft suddenly started to roll. Out of control, he unbuckled his seatbelt and fell free. His parachute opened and he landed unscathed. The Fireball crashed into a brand new PB-4Y on the taxiway, which I'm sure was very popular. Investigation of the accident showed that the lower wing skin had pulled free at the leading edge. Air had rushed into the wing and then into the fuselage, blowing the canopy off just as the wing structure disintegrated. Lake was unbelievably lucky to have survived. As it happens, he actually survived another Fireball about 6 months later when fuel flooded the cockpit from a burst fuel cell and he again had to bail out. I'm hoping he was assigned to test something else thereafter. Structural issues were only part of the complexities in operating the Fireball. For example, its unusual combination of a large, straight but quite fine wing, a cigar-shaped fuselage of relatively large diameter and large tail surfaces gave it unusual spinning characteristics. Shortly after spin entry, the rudder and elevator became unstalled before the wing did. That briefly allowed the plane to level out and then caused it to yaw violently before turning and spinning for another quarter turn before the situation then repeated again. Spins in the Fireball were therefore more like a series of snap rolls. Fortunately, executing a conventional spin recovery procedure enabled the pilot to recover the aircraft very quickly. And although unusual in some of its characteristics, the Fireball was generally quite a forgiving aircraft. Inverted spins were impossible to provoke because the control surface is unstalled as soon as the nose drops. As I'll get to a bit later, it was generally a very maneuverable fighter, perhaps a result of Ryan's previous experience with acrobatic leisure aircraft. Unlike contemporary jets, it took off easily. The jet engine didn't have enough power to get off the carrier on jet power alone, so the cyclone would be cranked all the way up at takeoff. Depending on the amount of wind over the deck, the jet could also be used, as could the ship's hydraulic catapult. Takeoff distance with a 15-knot wind was 777 feet with just the piston engine and 500 feet with the jet as well. With a 25-knot wind, that comes down to 570 and 366 feet respectively. In the air, the jet would be switched off and the Fireball cruised along at a shade over 150 miles an hour using the cyclone. In that configuration, its range was 1,500 miles. Interception radius with 2 drop tanks and the use of the jet was a bit over 300 miles. Landings took some getting used to, as the Fireball had a tricycle landing gear that was unusual for a carrier aircraft at this time. In order to get the wheels down and the hook engaged, the pilot needed to point the nose down slightly just as he reached the deck. This took a delicate touch, and several fireballs were lost in landing accidents. The position of the arrestor hook also caused some issues, as it would sometimes catch the wires before the nose wheel had touched the deck. This in turn led to the fireball slamming down and exceeding the limits of the gear. If the rear fuel cell was empty, then the aircraft also had a tendency to flop back once it had landed, wrinkling and weakening the fuselage skin. All of this further stressed the already suspect structure of the aircraft. Given that it was a first-of-the-kind aircraft, it was reportedly easy to maintain, though. 3 men could remove the cowl in an hour and 10 minutes. 4 men could change the piston engine in 7 hours. The jet was even easier to maintain, as the rear fuselage could be quickly unbolted to access the engine. It wasn't perfect, though, as the jet's location in the rear fuselage did create some issues around overheated wiring and plumbing. Some of these items were quite difficult to access as the plane was tightly packaged. Testing led to changes being made in some areas, but there was a war on and there wasn't time to get things perfect. Once again, it's to Ryan Aeronautics' great credit that they produced something as eminently usable as the Fireball in double quick time. On the 12th of April 1945, the destroyer Manata El Abel was cruising near Okinawa. She was part of the radar picket for the ongoing landings, a very dangerous assignment. At 20 to 3 in the afternoon, the destroyer was attacked by 3 kamikazes flying Mitsubishi Zeros. Her crew shot one down and drove another off. The third, though, got past a defensive fire and slammed into the aft engine room on the starboard side. 55 crewmen were killed, but worse was to come. The destroyer began to lose headway. Seconds after the impact, her captain observed another 2 aircraft orbiting high overhead. Suddenly, one of them broke away and dived at terrific speed into the destroyer. It hit near the waterline amidships. A massive explosion snapped the ship in two, and she sank in less than a minute. She was the first victim of the Oka, a horrifying piloted rocket kamikaze. In total, 84 men were killed in the sinking. The Navy was understandably worried about the prospect of these unstoppable rocket attacks. At this stage, they were relatively easy to defend against, as the rocket had to be carried within about 10 miles of its target by Betty bombers. But if the Japanese were able to develop longer-ranged versions, then they could be devastating to a relatively static invasion fleet. Amongst other measures, the Navy felt that they needed a faster, higher-flying interceptor to counter it. The Fireball program was therefore accelerated. I have to believe that this was mainly due to lack of understanding of the Oka. Its 3 rocket motors propelled it to over 600 miles an hour. Even with its extra jet power, the Fireball topped out at just above 400. The Vought Corsair was therefore a better candidate for an Oka interceptor, and Hellcats proved fairly capable of keeping the Bettys away in any case. As it happens, the first Fireball squadron had been assembled in the last few months of 1944. These hand-picked aviators, often aces, were initially known as VFX-1, but they were redesignated VF-66 Firebirds in January 1945 and received their first production FR-1 in March. 5 pilots were killed in crashes as VF-66 worked up. But despite these tragedies, on a gloomy morning in July, a dozen Fireballs were winched aboard USS Ranger for a shakedown. During this cruise, they accumulated 407 landings, executed 74 catapult takeoffs, and suffered no casualties. 1 Fireball went over the side and another one was written off on landing, but their pilots survived. As the cruise ended, the war finished without the Fireballs seeing action. They were, however, the first jet-powered aircraft to operate from an aircraft carrier, even though they always operated with the Cyclone switched on. When the war ended, the pace of the program fell. VF-66 was disbanded and its name and planes were transferred to VF-41. On the 5th of November, they deployed for a cruise on the USS Wake Island. It was on this cruise that Ensign Jake West very nearly made the first carrier landing on jet power alone. As he approached the deck, the Cyclone lost power, leaving just the jet engine. He successfully touched down. Unfortunately, it couldn't be proved as to whether he was still getting some power from the piston engine, and therefore his achievement was not chalked up as the first jet-powered landing on a carrier. I'm of the opinion that this assessment is a little unfair, but there we are. The F-41 made 4 further deployments and also made visits to a number of carriers, including FDR and Midway. The last full deployment was in June 1947. By this time, the stresses of repeated carrier landings were making the structure of the fireballs rather marginal. The aircraft were grounded in July 1947 and the program was terminated shortly thereafter. Essentially, the fireball was a good concept that got rather lost in the post-war period. Perhaps that would have been different if the Navy had got its planned 600 aircraft and therefore had a usable fleet. After all, the Fireball had the same armament as a Wildcat or Bearcat. 450 caliber Brownings in the inner wing panels, 300 rounds were carried for each gun. It wasn't just a test bed, it was a fully capable combat aircraft and could do things like carrying air-to-ground rockets as well. The air-to-air fighter mix of a US carrier in 1945 and 1946 consisted of Hellcats and Corsairs. Bearcats were also beginning to enter the inventory. Each of these are legendary fighters in their own right. But against all the odds, the Fireball is arguably better than any of them as an air-to-air fighter. When using both engines, its initial climb rate matched the Bearcat at over 4,000 feet per minute. Crucially, it could sustain that climb rate longer than a pure piston-engined fighter and head up to a higher service ceiling of 43,100 feet. Other Navy fighters topped out between 37 and 39,000 feet. It wasn't just a straight-line warrior either. At 200 miles an hour, the Navy assessment was that it could outmaneuver all existing Navy fighters, and it turned inside them all at 300 miles an hour. Its roll rate was as good as the Bearcats, which is regarded as exceptional in that regard. If you marry this up with a range of 1,500 miles when carrying a centerline drop tank, then you can see that the Fireball was actually a fantastic 1945 fighter. The problem was that there was no one to fight. Japan surrendered on August the 15th. The Navy found itself with a massive inventory of aircraft, no credible naval threat to fight, and inevitably slashed budgets. Fundamentally, the Fireball could only really be judged against a piston-engined fighter. Even a basic jet like a Vampire would easily overpower it if well flown, being well over 100 miles an hour faster. The Navy's own Phantom was slowly heading towards service and, with the notable exception of range, was a superior jet fighter to the Fireball. There wasn't a lot of point in buying something marginally better than a Bearcat when that aircraft was in mass production and was cheaper and easier to operate. Revolution, not evolution, was required. Perhaps if the war had dragged on, we would have seen carriers with Fireballs instead of Bearcats and Hellcats in the air superiority role, but it didn't, and we didn't. That doesn't make it a bad aircraft. It was a good concept and well executed. Ryan Aeronautical, though, didn't really capitalize on the good performance of the Fireball. Although they developed the turboprop and turbojet hybrid Darkstar from it, they don't appear to have made any serious attempt to pitch a pure jet fighter as an alternative to the numerous prototypes being pursued by the Navy. After attempting to make a wildly ambitious tail-standing vertical takeoff aircraft in the 1950s, they went on to produce drones for the Air Force and were bought by Teledyne in 1964. Teledyne itself was later swallowed up by Northrop Grumman. But those are stories for another time. The Fireball is yet another forgotten aircraft of first from the Cambrian explosion in the aviation industry after the Second World War. A good aircraft, but like so many chimeras, it was built to solve a problem that turned out not to exist. Jet carrier landings, although they still went spectacularly wrong from time to time, rapidly became routine. The Navy adapted, technology marched on.